Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you. A couple of years ago, I was in a taxi early in the morning in Shanghai on the way to the airport. I was really hungover, and I wasn't alone. I was sharing the taxi with a professor who was the head of the entrepreneurial program at my MBA school. So being hungover and having a captive audience, I decided I would ask what I thought was a challenging question. So I asked him, every day you're teaching people entrepreneurship. Can you really make someone into an entrepreneur? And his reply was, no, and most people shouldn't become entrepreneurs. You can take people right up to the edge of the pool, but you can't make them jump in. But what you can do is you can teach them to be comfortable with ambiguity. And if somebody's comfortable with ambiguity, they can take this back to their companies, and if it's a big company, especially in a big company, they can create intrapreneurialism, which is a benefit for everybody involved. So at the time, I was pretty happy with the answer. But now, I'm not so sure. 3 years ago, when I started my Executive MBA, again, a school known for its entrepreneurial program, there were 47 people in my class, and only 2% of them were entrepreneurs. So just one person was an entrepreneur, and that person was me. Now, 18 months after graduating, and it was tough, 17% of the class are entrepreneurs. So it's an 8x increase. So it would seem that there's a connection between studying or being exposed to entrepreneurship and becoming an entrepreneur. But is there really a connection? So I've been able to get a little bit more data. So earlier in this year, I published a book. It was about Japanese entrepreneurs and their startup stories. There wasn't a book like it, so I wanted to get it out there. And to create the book, what I did was I interviewed 20 pretty famous tech entrepreneurs who are in Japan. Actually, Yusuke, who spoke a couple hours ago, was one of those. And if we look at their profiles that I was able to gather, 20% of the entrepreneurs either studied or lived abroad when they were younger. 30% of them grew up in entrepreneurial families. 40% of them either interned when they were in high school or in college at a startup. So a full 90%, 18 of the entrepreneurs that I interviewed, were either exposed to entrepreneurship at an early age or chose to break free and do something different. So between these two data sets, the 47 people in my Executive MBA class, the 20 Japanese entrepreneurs that I interviewed to create the book, it would seem that exposure to entrepreneurialism will create a higher chance that you'll become an entrepreneur later in life. A causal relationship exists. Exposure creates entrepreneurs. But taking a step back, what is an entrepreneur? The definition I'll use is somebody who creates their own business, somebody who takes on risks, and somebody who follows a different path. So from these previous examples, it would seem that if you follow a different path when you're younger, if you study abroad or do something different, it will increase the likelihood that you'll take a different path as an adult. Similarly, being exposed to entrepreneurship, either through your family or as an intern, will increase the likelihood that you'll become an entrepreneur as an adult. Exposure creates entrepreneurship. So let's see, how does this play out in Japan? Now in Japan, the working age population is 77 million people, and 3.84% of the working age population is involved in entrepreneurship. So that's nearly 3 million people, which seems like a lot. But many of them are working for small, independent businesses, probably many enjoying a much better lifestyle than I do, trying to run a high-growth startup. But there are very few startups in Japan. I think what I see with my offices in Harajuku daily is there's a never-ending wave and supply of people ready to start the next hip retail shop, cool cafe, or trendy boutique, only to be replaced 6 months later or a year later by the next eager entrepreneur. But again, there are very few startups. And by startup, I mean a company with fast, exponential growth. And the major reason for this is few people are exposed to startups. There are few examples. So few people take this risky path. Beyond that, the legal and financial risks of entrepreneurship in Japan are very high. There's little separation between a company and the entrepreneur. So if you're an owner of a business and it goes bankrupt, your assets can be taken. So the creditors could take your house, they could take your car, they could take your savings. So the risks are very high. In Japan, in bankruptcy, creditors on average recover 93% of the assets that they've loaned out. This is the highest in the world, which is a great stat if you're a creditor and you want to lower your risk. But if you're an entrepreneur, especially an entrepreneur of a high-risk startup, it sucks. Then, of course, in Japan, the social risk is significant. The fear of failure is pervasive. If you're running a venture and it fails, it can make a real deep impact on your social relationships. It can strain your family relationships. You could lose friends. Certainly, former colleagues or business associates may no longer return your phone calls. It can be devastating and very hard to come back for this. Your constricted social circle makes the amount of opportunities that you have even smaller. Now, I'd argue a lot of this comes in early education in Japan. When Japanese children are being exposed to socialization, and they're being taught to be part of the group before anything else, and not to break a rule. So if a child wants to get out of the boundaries a little bit, then if their actions aren't okay by the group, that can be deeply frowned upon. If they go out too far and really break a significant rule, then they could become ostracized. Now, to give a very personal example, this is my son. Earlier this year, I was taking him to a soccer game. So he played for his elementary school's Bukatsu soccer team. He went to a Japanese elementary school. So to paint the scenario for you, so it's raining, I'm taking him by car, and we're very late. So we're trying to get there as fast as possible. And I told him, okay, I'll drive you right up to the gate of the ground. You just hop out, run in, we'll make it on time. It'll be perfectly fine. But he wouldn't. So we were starting to go at it a little bit, and I'm saying, just hop out, just hop out. But he wouldn't. He finally told me, Dad, there's a rule that students have to go through the gates of the ground with their parents. So I can understand the rule, it makes sense. It's probably there for safety reasons, right? So that's the genesis of the rule. But here, given the circumstances, it's raining, we're late, we're getting angry, just hop out. Wouldn't listen. He was starting to get upset, I was starting to get upset. So we went and parked. It was a place that we've never been to before, so we had to park far away. At this point, we're late. So we're walking to the ground. Both of us are getting quite angry. We're soaked. And I told him, why don't you just run ahead? Just go forward, tell him your dad's on the phone, tell him he's tying his shoe. It doesn't matter. I'm right behind you. You'll just get right there. And he got, no, not doing it. So we finally got there, late, soaked, bad moods, and he got benched for pretty much the whole game. And of course, we got lots of nasty stares from everybody else, like, what is this crazy gaijin doing here? Now, that's not where the story ends. So later in the day, we had to move location for an award ceremony. Now the whole scene repeats itself. We're driving there, we're late, it's in the rain. So we missed the award ceremony. And just as we're getting up, parents and students are leaving. They're giving us crazy faces like, who the hell are we? And I got really upset at my son. So all the kind of anger and frustration and curiosity that had been building up throughout the day came out. I got mad at him, and he broke down in tears. So here we are in the middle of the street. He hadn't played. We missed the award ceremony. He's crying. I'm angry. It really wasn't my finest moment as a father. But what it did was it really brought home the dynamics that we're dealing with. Here's me as an entrepreneur, as a foreigner, willing to bend the rule, to do something different if it's practical and the circumstances would require it. And here's my son taught by Japanese school never to break a rule, always to be part of the group. Now, it's these dynamics that really put a damper on entrepreneurialism later in life, and that keep people from becoming entrepreneurs later. But even with this backdrop, it's not all bad news for Japan's entrepreneurial ecosystem. There are a lot of positive things happening right now. So right now, the appeal of startups is growing. There's a lot more early stage support for people to start startups, so there's more incubators, there's more capital, there's more mentoring. Now, putting these things together means there's more events. With more events, you get more exposure. Now, with more exposure, you get more people entering a startup as an employee. With more people entering startups as an employee, some of these are going to break away and start their own companies. Now, once you have more startups, you get more examples of success. When you have more examples of success, you're going to get more startups. So you have a virtuous cycle going. Now, with more startups, and this is where it gets interesting, you get more serial entrepreneurs. And serial entrepreneurs bring with them more capital follow them and more investment follow them. And the size of the opportunity that they start to challenge grows. So in the next couple of years, the dynamics have been created that the next Google or Facebook could be created in Japan. The Japanese entrepreneurial ecosystem is becoming much more dynamic. Startups are being grown. Entrepreneurs' risk tolerance is being stretched. So from everything that I've seen and experienced, entrepreneurialism is learnable. Maybe risk tolerance is innate, but it can grow. From the data that I personally experienced, it would seem that there's a systematic conversion between being exposed to entrepreneurialism when you're young and later on you becoming an entrepreneur. And this is what's happening in Japan today. More and more people are being exposed to entrepreneurialism. More people are being exposed to startups. So what we are seeing is more entrepreneurs and more startups. More people are now getting closer to the edge of the pool. More people are becoming comfortable with ambiguity. And more Japanese are diving into startups. Thank you.